I'm about ready to start up Office Hours with Bob Ross, and what I'm going to do is at least allow you to see what's going on with the platform, and I'm going to address a question. I'm about ready to, the meetup has already begun, but I'm going to go ahead and start recording it, and you can watch here, or you can click the link that I'll put up after it's completed, and then this will give you an idea, and next week we can meet up if you have any questions on the platform for musiclessons.com. Alright guys, welcome to Office Hours with Bob Ross, and what I'm going to do is address a question that was asked by John, who is one of the founders of musiclessons.com, and he wanted to know what advice I have for getting more in depth with the fretboard, like really exploring areas of the fretboard, and then from there going off into other areas of the fretboard to make the bigger picture. And this past week I made a video about this for my YouTube channel, and I discussed this very thing of trying to break out of scale patterns. So it's kind of a coincidence that he asked me this question. But basically, here's what I would say to do. It's going to be a combination of things, and depending on where you are, how much experience you have with the fretboard, will really determine which step that you need to be doing or what action you need to take next in order to break down some of these barriers. So step number one is you need to find some way of seeing the fretboard in order to get your way through. And if you don't have some sort of a setup for that, then you can check out what I've done on the platform, musiclessons.com, where I have the 5 shapes. Now, I'm not the only one that sees the fretboard like that, but with the 5 shapes, it lays out 5 areas of the fretboard, and you can go through all 12 keys, and you can do your arpeggios, you can go through multiple scales in using this, although I have a little bit different way of seeing like that diminished scale, so and the augmented. So there's a couple of variations on that, but overall I use the 5 shapes when I'm going through to learn the fretboard. Now previously what I had done is the 6 fingerings, and both of these, which I found out later, well, the 6 fingerings were shown to me by a professor of mine, and then later on I found it's basically the same way Jimmy Bruno envisioned the, he sees the fretboard, and then from there it went off into the 5 shapes, and that, a lot of that, definitely comes from Jimmy Bruno. There's some variations that I've done in learning scales that differ from his approach, but with taking lessons with Jimmy, that opened up another way for me to see it. So it's been kind of a combination of the two. But you need a set way in order to visualize the fretboard, and you need to have the basics, the foundation laid out before you can even think about going off and trying to break out of these shapes. So as far as the question of what I would do, step number one is, like I said, lay the foundation. So for me, I could take the key of C, and I see the 5 areas of the fretboard, and what I do is I go through and I make sure that I can play all the way up and down. Usually what I have my students do is go through the fretboard doing this, and what they'll do initially is learn the 5 individual shapes, and then go back and make a try to combine it all together into one big shape in itself. But essentially, here's what happens: you go through, and usually I set the benchmark of hitting eighth notes at 100. Although I would say that depending on what your goal is, you may want to increase that. I wouldn't say that you need to constantly be working on running up and down scales. Once again, it depends on what your goal is. But, if I take like key of C, what I'll have them do is go up, and this is shape 5 in a key of C. Now shape 6. And then shape 7. The names of the shapes correspond to the scale degrees. This is shape number 2, so it started on D. And then shape number 3 starting on E. Now when when I have my students go through and learn this, it like I said, I start with one shape at a time, and you go back through and you find where the roots are in each one of these. And it's important to do that because when you learn it in this way, you're not starting on the root. Although you could start it on the root, go back down to the lowest note, and come back. But I usually don't start with the root. I start with the lowest possible note, and then I come back to the root. But when I run the big, scale, as I term it sometimes, and that has a couple different meanings, but in this way of meaning it is running all the way up through the fretboard and ending on the root note C. So what I'll have them do is learn one key at a time, make sure that you're also concentrating on the roots, the notes that are within the shapes, and then you go back after you've learned all the 12 keys and you start combining them. So maybe you go up in the key of C, down in F, up in B flat, down in E flat. And you notice that I'm calling out force, playing the scales in force because it's what us jazz guys do, So from there, what I suggest to do is to take, and this again I've covered before, and it's in my videos that I've put out, my lesson videos, is to take one area. Let's say I start in the key of C, and I'll grab a stand real quick. So what I do is I go up in the key of C, come back down in the key of C, key of F. So this would be shape number 2 in the key of F. This is shape 6 in the key of B flat. Now I'm going to go to the shape 3 in the key of E flat. So you're running through all 12 keys in one area of the fretboard. And you have to make some minor adjustments to this because not every single one of these is going to have a G natural in it, so you can't just use that as your starting point. So you have to figure out how you're going to shift that. Usually when I go into the key of D flat, usually I'll shift it down to shape number 3 at that point. But you get all the 12 keys to where you can play in one area, and especially, it could be in any style, but especially in jazz, what you find is there's a lot of modulations, so your ability to go in and out between keys is very important. From there, running the usual things that we all have done, which is running through patterns of 3-note groupings, 4-note groupings, running intervals of thirds and fourths. And this is another thing that I've talked about. Again, it's in my lesson videos where I talk about using the 4 directions. And the 4 directions is where you go through and, let's say I'm going to take thirds and I'm in the key of C. I could use an ascending version where I'm taking a lower note to go to a higher note. Right? And then I could also use a descending version of this where I start on the upper note of the third, so like a B down to a G. Then I could use ascending, descending, so I'm ascending, descending. And then I use descending, ascending. So I run the 4 directions, I go through that. I may run fifths and sixths and really get familiar with the intervals. At that point, once I feel pretty familiar with everything that's going on with what I've thrown out so far, and this is only covering the major scales so far. From there, what I like to do is to go through and maybe take something like the fourths or the thirds and try to go through all the shapes sticking to a string group. And this is one of these things where it could you could turn it into chord, like running like your thirds up and down the fretboard like that. But what I like to do is articulate them. And then once you get here, maybe you go to the next string group and walk your way back down. The other way that you can see that is you go up so far up the fretboard. Let's say I make it here to the D, F, and then maybe I start here, E, G. Not the same. And so forth up the fretboard. So you're not limited by the shapes that you've learned. that's one way to start breaking those patterns down that you're finding perhaps between the different areas of the fretboard. The other thing I like to do is just to take one specific key and have a drone. I don't have my freeze pedal on right now, but just taking a drum and allowing yourself to really explore the scale, because this was the other question that John had asked about, really knowing these areas really well before breaking them down. Is I'll take a certain key and really hone in on that certain key where I'm playing within, like for example, I'm in shape number 5. Or I could do it without a drone too, is to go through and just see if I can play around within the shape and really concentrating on not just running up scales, running up through the different patterns like that, but to actually start at different places and use different intervals as I'm playing. That helps a lot, because it's one thing to know how to play the scale ascending, descending, or even descending back to ascending, but to be able to actually start at any point and then explore it, by using larger intervals is a whole nother thing. And that's where you really figure out how well you know it. Because I'm sure you've been in a situation where you find that you felt like you knew the scales really well, and then you go to play and it feels like you don't know it too well when you're trying to improvise. And part of that reason could be that you haven't explored it enough yet. You've only ran through patterns or played it ascending, descending like most of us do, and now when you try to improvise, it just sounds like you're running a scale again. So that's a difficult thing in the beginning. Take it slow, because I think some people may find it frustrating because you're used to a certain pattern, but give yourself some time. And think simple. Don't be too complex with it. Don't try to play a lot of fast stuff. Don't try to be hip with everything that you're doing. You got to allow yourself time to process it and to see the bigger picture of it. If you allow that time, then it's going to start to open up the fretboard for you. The other thing that I like to do is to take 2 shapes. So if I was in shape 5, once again in key C, and shape 6, this can go back to the drone again, is I like to go through and just see if there's ways that I can combine the shapes to see the bigger picture. And finding where maybe there's some overlap between them. And I'll give you an example here where you have shape number 5 and a 6, where you have the top 2 strings here, where you see the D, E, and F, G, and A. If you have the D, E, and F, that E and that F start to go over into shape number 6, right? The G and the A is a point to where they share the common tone here of the A. So you try to find, is there ways to go in and out between these where you don't have to necessarily think, here's a shape, here's a shape, here's a shape, here's a shape. And you could also prime yourself for that by running up one shape and down another, up one, down another, just to get the flow of it, and then start to try to make that bigger connection. Also, in the same vein here, is something that most of us have come across, with books like Mick Goodrick's book, The Advancing Guitarist, where you have, and Jim Hall talked about this too, where you go up one string playing. So maybe you go in and out between these 2 shapes. Start to think about old blues there. Alright, there it is. There's where that C7 comes out. But anyways, so you go through and you find, just one string exercises. And you don't put all your fingers down. Maybe you limit it to just a finger. That way you're not stuck into, well, this is where my fingers go every time, now I'm locked in. You pick a finger or a couple fingers and see if you can move your way in and out. And also incorporating intervals, because that's going to break out those scale patterns. So, that's a few thoughts on how to break it down. If you're unfamiliar with the shapes, then, check out what I've put up on the platform. That way you can see how I'm seeing it. I just recently updated it, and I talk about the 4 directions in that course as well. But this is some of the ways that I have worked on breaking down these different areas on the guitar, and it's still a work in progress. I mean, it's something that's takes years, and I mean, every time that you think that you have something down really well, and then you play a certain tune, or you're on a gig, then you notice, hey, that spot doesn't feel too comfortable, so now I got to work on that. Alright guys, that's it for this week's Bob Ross, Office Hours with Bob Ross. Again, I want to thank all of you for watching, and make sure that you're leaving your comments for me, or questions, that way I can answer it next week. I believe next week is the 22nd, so September 22nd at 1 p.m. I'll be live again on the platform to answer your questions. Alright guys, have a good one. Again, that was some behind the scenes for musiclessons.com, Office Hours with Bob Ross. Next week, I won't be live on Facebook, but I just wanted to throw out what takes place. I answer questions, and if you hop on, you can chat with me, you can interact. I know you can do it on here too, but and I enjoy the interaction that you guys, you know, have engaged with me, you know, over the years. But next week I'll have a link up. You'll see me advertising it again. Hop on the platform. I mean, we can do face-to-face. It's not just text-based, right? You'll be able to actually interact, and then we can create a community around this and keep chatting. Again, it's free. You don't have to pay anything to do it. It's just, you know, just hop on, ask me some questions, and I'd be happy to help out. Have a good one.